There is a room in every house where a child once sat alone, and the silence in that room was louder than any scream. Perhaps you were that child. Perhaps the door did not open when you called. Perhaps it opened, and what came through it was worse than the waiting. I want you to sit with that room for just a moment, because everything I am going to say tonight begins there. In that room, in that silence, in that small body that already understood, long before it had words for it, that it was alone in the universe. That is the wound. And I promise you, before this hour is finished, you will understand why that wound, left in the dark, learns to drink, to smoke, to swallow, to scroll, to starve, to rage, why it will do almost anything, anything at all, to never feel that silence again. Stay with me. This is not a lecture about weakness. This is an account of the soul's desperate, half-blind attempt to save itself. And if you have ever wondered why you can't simply stop, why willpower alone has never been enough, the answer is waiting for you in the very story I am about to tell. Good evening. I do not come to you tonight with easy comfort, because comfort that is easy is usually a lie, and I have spent a long life among the suffering, learning to distrust easy things. I come instead with something harder and, I believe, far more valuable, an understanding. Because when a man or a woman finally understands the shape of their own suffering, something extraordinary happens. The suffering does not vanish. Let us not promise miracles, but it stops being meaningless. And a pain that has meaning can be carried. A pain without meaning crushes. So let us begin where all true understanding begins, not with the symptom, but with the wound beneath it. A child is not born broken. A child is born whole, astonishingly, almost unbearably whole. Watch an infant for a single afternoon, and you will see what I mean. There is no pretending in it. There is no mask. Joy arrives, and the whole body sings with it. Distress arrives, and the whole body weeps with it. Nothing is held back, because there is as yet nothing to hold back with. The child is pure psyche, unguarded, unarmored, entirely present. Now imagine what happens to that unguarded creature when the world it is born into is not equal to its trust. Imagine the mother who cannot see the child because her own darkness stands in the way. Imagine the father whose love arrives only through his fists, or worse, arrives so rarely that the child begins to doubt love exists at all. Imagine neglect, not even cruelty, simply absence, simply a house where a child's cries eventually stop being answered, and so in time stop being made. Imagine shame poured into a small body before that body even has the language to ask why. The child does not have the luxury of understanding any of this. The child has only one task in those early years, and it is not happiness, it is survival. And so something remarkable and terrible happens at once. The child begins to split. I want you to understand this splitting, because it is the beginning of everything that follows. The part of the child that is spontaneous, needy, vulnerable, and true. That part learns quickly that it is not safe to show itself. It is too much. It asks for too much. It feels too much. And so it goes underground. It does not disappear. Nothing in the psyche ever simply disappears. It goes into hiding, into the cellar of the personality, and there it waits. Meanwhile, on the surface, a different figure begins to grow. The mask, the performance, the good child, the invisible child, the strong child, the child who needs nothing because needing was too dangerous. This mask learns to smile when it wants to scream. It learns to achieve because achievement, unlike love, could sometimes be earned reliably. It learns to disappear into a corner, into a book, into silence, because silence, at least, could not be punished. This split is not pathology. I want to be very clear about that. This split is genius. It is the most extraordinary adaptive achievement of the human psyche. A small, powerless creature reorganizing its entire inner world overnight in order to survive an unbearable environment. There is nothing weak about it. It is, in fact, a kind of heroism, though no one ever calls it that, because the hero is 3 years old and there is no one watching to give the medal. But here is the tragedy, and I ask you to lean in close for this part, because this is the hinge on which the whole of tonight's understanding turns. What is banished from consciousness does not cease to exist. It goes into what I have called the shadow, the underground river of everything we could not afford to feel, express, or become. And that river does not dry up simply because we have stopped looking at it. It keeps flowing in the dark, gathering force, gathering grief, gathering an unspeakable hunger for the very things it was denied: safety, tenderness, belonging, relief. And sooner or later, that river must surface. It always surfaces. The only question, and it is the question that determines the shape of an entire human life, is how. Let me give you a word for what forms in that underground place, because it will help you recognize it in yourself. I call it a complex, not in the everyday sense of an inferiority complex, a phrase people toss around carelessly, but in the deeper sense, a cluster of memory, emotion, and belief split off from the main personality that behaves almost like a second self living inside the first. A complex formed in childhood trauma has a peculiar power. It is not merely a memory you can recall and set down. It is alive. It has its own energy, its own logic, its own voice. And that voice, formed in the mouth of a frightened child, says things like, "You are unlovable, you are too much, you are not enough, you will always be alone, you cannot trust anyone, you are fundamentally, irreparably flawed." And because this complex formed before the reasoning mind had fully developed, it does not respond to reason. You cannot argue a wounded 5-year-old out of terror with a well-constructed sentence. Believe me, I have tried, and I have watched brilliant, articulate adults try for years in vain. Here is what makes the complex so dangerous. It is autonomous. It does not wait for permission. It rises up of its own accord, usually at the worst possible moment, in the middle of an argument with someone you love, in the silence after a small failure, in the particular quality of light on a Sunday afternoon that reminds the body, though not the conscious mind, of a house long since left behind. And when it rises, it seizes the wheel. Suddenly you are not the adult you have built yourself to be. Suddenly you are the child again, flooded, overwhelmed, and, this is the crucial part, reaching with everything in you for anything that will make the flood stop. This is the moment addiction is born, not in a back alley, not in a bottle. It is born in that instant of unbearable flooding when the complex has seized command and the whole organism screams a single, wordless demand. Make this stop, now, by any means necessary. I want to say something to you now that may surprise you, because it runs against nearly everything our age has been taught to believe about this subject. Addiction is not, at its root, a disease of pleasure seeking. It is not moral failure, and it is not simple weakness of will. Addiction is an attempted cure. It is the wounded psyche's best available answer to an unbearable question. It is, in its own tragic way, an act of self-medication performed by a healer who has no other medicine in the cabinet. Think for a moment about what the substance or the behavior actually does in that first unguarded moment before the chains tighten. The drink loosens the armor around the heart, and for one evening the isolated man feels briefly connected to the room around him. The drug floods the nervous system with a peace that was never once offered freely in childhood, and for an hour the abandoned child inside the adult body finally feels held. The compulsive eating fills a hollow that has nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with absence. The endless scrolling, the gambling, the frantic pursuit of one relationship after another. These are not simply bad habits. They are, each of them, a desperate reaching toward the very thing the child was denied. Relief, connection, aliveness, a temporary ceasefire in a war that has been running since before memory began. This is why shame never cures addiction. This is why willpower alone so rarely holds. You cannot shame a drowning man out of reaching for a rope, even if the rope is fraying, even if the rope is slowly pulling him under from a different angle. He does not yet know there is another way to reach the shore. Until he does, the rope, however dangerous, is the only thing between him and the depths. To take it from him with nothing to replace it is not healing. It is merely a second abandonment, dressed up as discipline. I have sat across from many such men and women in my consulting room over the years, and I will tell you what I found. Again and again, beneath the compulsion, beneath the craving, beneath the relapse that came after so many sincere promises, I found a child, every single time. A child still waiting in that room. a child who had never been told that the terror would end, that the hunger would be met, that it was safe now to feel. The adult body had grown up around that child, like bark around a wound in a tree, but the wound itself had never closed. It had simply been covered. There is something else I must tell you, something I came to understand only slowly, over the long course of clinical work and my own inner labor, and it may be the most important thing I say to you tonight. The hunger beneath addiction is not only a hunger for comfort, it is, at its deepest layer, a spiritual hunger. I do not use that word lightly, and I do not mean it in any narrow religious sense. I mean that the human soul has, built into its very structure, a longing for something larger than itself, for meaning, for transcendence, for a sense of belonging to something that outlasts the small, frightened, isolated ego. This longing is not an indulgence. It is as real and as necessary as the need for food, for sleep, for touch. When a child's early world offers no safe path toward that larger belonging, no sense of being held by something greater, no experience of the sacred, no living connection to meaning, that longing does not disappear. It goes underground with everything else. And later in life, when the ache for transcendence rises up, unnamed and unrecognized, the psyche will reach for whatever is nearest that can produce, however briefly, a taste of that expansion, that release from the prison of the isolated self. This is the secret at the heart of every intoxication. The drink, the drug, the rush of the gamble, the ecstasy of the compulsive high. Each one offers a counterfeit of the numinous. Each one offers for a moment dissolution of the boundary between the small aching self and something larger. The tragedy is that it is counterfeit. It borrows against a debt it can never repay. The relief is real, but it is theft, not earning, and every theft from the body and the spirit eventually comes due, with punishing interest. I have come to believe that many who suffer under the weight of addiction are not, in fact, the most cynical among us, quite the opposite. They are very often the most spiritually hungry, souls with an unusually intense thirst for meaning, for aliveness, for the sacred, who were simply never shown a legitimate well to drink from, and so drank, instead, from the nearest puddle that shimmered like water. The tragedy is not that they wanted too little. The tragedy is that what they wanted was infinite, and they were offered only a bottle. This is why the true cure for addiction is never merely abstinence. Abstinence alone leaves the ancient hunger unfed, standing at the door, and sooner or later it will find another door to try. The true cure must include the slow, patient discovery of a genuine well, a real relationship to meaning, to connection, to something larger than the wounded self, capable at last of satisfying a thirst that was never really about the substance in the first place. Before we go further toward healing, I want to speak about a particular danger that afflicts those who have learned very early, to survive by performance. Many of you listening tonight are not visibly broken. You go to work, you raise your children, you smile in the correct places. You have built, brick by careful brick, a persona, a public face so convincing that even you, some days, forget it is a mask. This is not dishonesty. It is armor, and it was necessary once. But I ask you to consider what it costs to wear armor every day of your life, in every room, with everyone, including and especially with yourself. The persona is meant to be worn, not to become the whole of who you are. When it does become the whole, when the performance of being fine consumes the entirety of a life, the shadow does not become weaker for being so well hidden. It becomes stronger. It gathers pressure exactly as a river gathers force behind a dam. And this is why so many addictions live in secret, behind lives that look, from the outside, entirely successful. The high functioning executive drinking alone after the house has gone quiet. The devoted parents secretly starving themselves into a shape they believe might finally be lovable enough. The respected professional whose private hours are consumed by a compulsion no one at the office could ever imagine. These are not contradictions. They are the direct and inevitable consequence of a persona built too well over a wound tended too little. If this describes you, hear me clearly. The mask is not the enemy. The mask kept you alive. But a mask that is never removed becomes a coffin, and the work ahead of you is not to destroy the mask in one violent motion. That is rarely wise and rarely possible, but to learn slowly, in safe company, how to set it down for an hour at a time, until the face beneath it no longer feels like a stranger. Now I want to speak directly about the path forward, because understanding without direction is merely a more sophisticated form of despair, and I did not come here tonight to leave you in despair. The first and most essential act of healing is this: you must go back into that room, not literally, and not all at once, and never, ever alone if it can be helped, but in the safety of your own inner work, in the company of a skilled guide. If one is available to you, you must find your way back to the child who was left there, and you must do something no one did at the time. You must listen. I do not mean this sentimentally. I mean it as a technical psychological necessity. The complex that drives the addiction will not release its grip through argument, through shame, through sheer force of the will. It will only begin to loosen when the feeling trapped inside it is finally, consciously felt and witnessed, not relived blindly and helplessly, as happens in every relapse, but felt on purpose, in safety, with an adult consciousness standing beside the child this time, instead of abandoning it once again. This is harder than it sounds, and I will not pretend otherwise. To turn toward that old pain rather than away from it goes against every instinct the body spent years perfecting. But I have watched it happen again and again in consulting rooms and in circles of honest company. The moment a person finally says the unspeakable thing out loud, I was so afraid, I was so alone, no one came. Something in the nervous system exhales for the first time in decades, not because the past has changed, it cannot change, but because the child, for the first time, is not alone with it anymore. And the craving that lived in that isolation begins slowly to lose its terrible urgency, because its true purpose was never really the substance at all. Its true purpose was to be witnessed. And now, finally, it is. I want to correct a mistake that I see made constantly in clinics, in recovery programs, in well meaning families everywhere. The belief that healing means eliminating the wounded part, cutting it away like a diseased limb, silencing it forever. This is not healing. This is merely a more polite form of the very abandonment that caused the wound in the first place. The goal is not eradication. The goal is integration. That frightened, hungry, wounded child inside you is not your enemy, and it never was. It is the most vulnerable part of your own soul, and it has been trying, this entire time, in the only language it knew, to tell you something true, that you were hurt, that the hurt mattered, that it still matters, and that it deserves, at long last, to be brought home rather than locked in the cellar and fed through a slot in the door. When that integration begins, when the adult you have become finally turns around, walks back down into the cellar, and says to the child there, I see you now, I am not leaving, you are safe with me, the entire architecture of the personality begins to shift. The energy that was once spent maintaining the split, guarding the door, feeding the mask, numbing the ache, all of that tremendous, exhausting energy becomes available again for the first time since childhood for living. This is not a metaphor for comfort. This is, quite literally, where the strength for a new life comes from. It was inside you the entire time, locked behind a door you were too frightened to open alone. I said earlier that the deepest hunger beneath addiction is spiritual, and I want to return to this because it points the way toward what must eventually replace the counterfeit relief of the substance or the compulsion. A life organized around the avoidance of pain is not in the end a life at all. It is a long defensive maneuver. Healing requires something more than the absence of the old wound. It requires the presence of something worth living for. This is why I have seen so often that recovery which lasts is recovery that is accompanied by a rediscovered sense of purpose, a calling, a creative work, a genuine community, a relationship to something the person experiences as sacred, whatever form that takes for them. This is not incidental to the healing. It is very often the heart of it. The energy that once drove the craving does not vanish when the craving loosens its grip. It must go somewhere. If it is not given a worthy channel, creative work, honest relationship, service to something beyond the self, a genuine spiritual practice, it will drift sooner or later back toward the old counterfeit because the psyche cannot tolerate emptiness indefinitely. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the soul is no exception. This is why the question I ask everyone who comes to me seeking freedom from a destructive pattern is never only what are you running from, but also, and just as urgently, what now are you running toward? I must also say this plainly. No one heals this alone. I know the story we like to tell of the solitary individual, gritting their teeth, conquering their demons through private strength alone. It is a beautiful story, and it is very largely false. The wound was made in relationship, in the failure of connection at a moment when connection was desperately needed. And so, by its very nature, the wound can only be healed in relationship, in the presence of another human being, or several, who can offer now what was missing then: steady attention, patience with the mess, a refusal to look away when things get difficult, an insistence that you are still worth staying for even on your worst day. This is why every genuine path toward freedom from addiction, in every tradition I have studied, involves other people. It involves being known, not performing for, not impressing, not managing the impression left behind, but known, in the plain and difficult sense of the word, flaws and fractures and all. The isolation that the addiction promised to cure was never actually cured by the substance. It was only ever cured, truly cured, by finally being seen by another person and finding that you were not, after all, cast out for it. If you take nothing else from tonight, take this. Reach toward another human being. Not when you have already fixed yourself and are presentable again now. As you are, the reaching itself is the beginning of the cure. I want to say something too about the falling down, because everyone who walks this road falls down, and the shame that follows the fall is often more dangerous than the fall itself. The old complex does not surrender its territory in a single battle. It has held that ground since childhood, and it will not release it all at once, simply because you have finally understood where it came from. There will be days, perhaps many days, when the flood rises faster than the new understanding can hold it back, and the old pattern reasserts itself. This is not proof that the work has failed. It is proof that the work is real, that you are contending with something that was never trivial to begin with. I have watched people mistake a single fall for the whole truth of who they are and abandon, in a wave of shame, months or years of genuine progress. Do not make this mistake. Shame is the very same weapon the wound has always used against you. The accusation you are fundamentally, irreparably flawed, dressed up now in the language of failed recovery. Do not hand it fresh ammunition. When you fall, and you may, the task is not to punish yourself into some imagined worthiness. The task is the same as it has always been: to turn back gently toward the frightened part of you that reached for relief in the only way it still knew how, and to say to it again patiently, as many times as it takes, I see you, I am still here, we try again. I would not be honest with you tonight if I left you with the impression that this journey is only about the removal of a symptom. It is much larger than that, and I want you to see the size of it, because the size of it is where the true courage lies. What you are being asked to do, if you take this path seriously, is nothing less than to become the parent to yourself that circumstance denied you, to build inside your own being a steady, loving, unshakable presence capable of holding whatever rises, the terror, the grief, the rage, the shame, the longing, without flinching, without abandoning, without reaching first for the nearest anesthetic. This is not a small undertaking. This is, in fact, one of the great works a human life can accomplish. It is nothing less than the slow construction of a soul strong enough to hold its own suffering with dignity, and in doing so, to finally set that suffering down. Consider, too, what it will mean for those who come after you, the children you may raise, the friends who watch how you carry your own difficulty, the strangers who will one day meet you at their own lowest hour and take courage simply from the fact that you are still standing. Every wound that is finally faced, instead of merely inherited, becomes in some quiet way a gift to the generations that follow. The pattern that was handed down to you does not have to be handed down again. Somewhere, a chain that has run unbroken through mothers and fathers and children for longer than anyone can trace is waiting for someone brave enough to be the one who finally stops it. That someone can be you, not because you are without wounds, but precisely because you have chosen at last to look at them honestly instead of passing them on unexamined, the way they were passed to you. And here is the part I most want you to carry with you when you leave this room tonight. The very fact that you were wounded so deeply and yet still stand here, still breathing, still reaching, still searching for a way through. This is not evidence of your weakness. It is evidence of an almost unbearable strength that has been operating in you this entire time, mostly unseen, mostly unthanked, keeping you alive through years that might reasonably have destroyed someone else. That strength did not leave you. It has simply been spent until now defending a wound instead of healing it. Redirected, that same strength is more than sufficient for the journey ahead. There is one more thing I must tell you before I let you go tonight, because without it, this whole account would remain incomplete, and I have never had much patience for incomplete truths. The wounded part of you does not stay silent simply because you have learned to ignore it during the day. It speaks, it has always spoken. It speaks in the dream that wakes you at 3 in the morning, drenched in a fear you cannot name. It speaks in the sudden, disproportionate flood of anger at some small slight that on reflection hardly warranted it. It speaks in the body, in the tightened jaw, the racing heart, the stomach that will not settle, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep repairs. It speaks in the pattern that repeats itself across every relationship you have ever entered, as though you keep, without meaning to, choosing the same room and the same silence over and over, hoping this time someone will finally answer. I ask you to stop treating these messages as malfunctions to be suppressed and to start treating them as what they actually are. Communications from the part of you that has been carrying the unbearable weight all along, doing its best in the only vocabulary available to it to tell you where the wound still lives. A dream of drowning is not nonsense. A sudden panic in a crowded room is not weakness. These are not glitches in an otherwise functioning machine. They are letters written in a foreign hand from a part of your own being that has never stopped trying to reach you. I remember many years ago a man who came to me utterly convinced that his life was ruled by chance and bad luck alone, that his drinking was simply something that had happened to him, the way weather happens to a landscape. He described, almost in passing, a recurring dream, a small boy standing at the end of a long hallway, calling out, and no one in the house ever turning to look. He had dismissed this dream for years as meaningless. It took a long while and considerable courage on his part before he was willing to sit with the obvious truth staring back at him from his own unconscious, that the hallway was the house of his childhood, that the boy calling out was himself, and that every glass he had ever lifted to his lips across 3 decades had been, in its own tragic way, an attempt to walk down that hallway and finally answer. I do not tell you this story to suggest that every dream must be so neatly decoded, or that healing arrives the moment a symbol is understood. It is far slower and far more demanding than that. I tell you this because I want you to understand that your inner world is not your enemy, even when it feels chaotic, even when it frightens you, even when it seems to be sabotaging the very life you are trying to build. It is at every moment attempting to communicate with you in images and sensations and unbidden feelings about exactly where the old wound remains unhealed. Learn its language with patience and with help, and you will find that what once looked like self-destruction begins to look like something else entirely, an urgent, persistent, almost desperate love letter from the part of yourself you left behind, still hoping, after all these years, to finally be brought home. So let us return, one last time, to that room where we began, the room where a child once sat alone, and the silence was louder than any scream. I want you to picture it again, but differently this time. I want you to picture the door finally opening, not a stranger walking through it. You, the person you have become, walking back through that door, kneeling down beside that child, and saying the words that were never said, I am here now. It is safe. You do not have to carry this by yourself anymore. That is the whole of the work in the end, not the elimination of the past. No one has that power, and anyone who promises it to you is selling something false. The work is this: to stop abandoning yourself the way you were once abandoned, and to begin instead the long, patient, deeply worthy labor of coming home to your own soul. You did not choose the wound. No child ever does. But you are the only one who can choose now what becomes of it. You can let it go on ruling you from the shadows, demanding tribute in the form of one substance or another, one compulsion after the next. Or you can turn, finally, and face it, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a frightened part of your own being, waiting all this time simply to be loved back into the whole. The choice, difficult as it is, has always been yours, and the strength to make it, however hidden it has been until now, has been yours as well from the very beginning. Go gently with yourselves tonight, and when the old ache rises, as it will, do not reach first for the thing that numbs it. Reach, instead, for the truth beneath it. That is where the healing has been waiting for you all along. Thank you.